led agrarian lives for much of the 19th century. And even when they moved to the city of Urmia, a hub of agrarian wholesale markets in wheat and raisins, they often engaged in trade that involved their village roots and maintained close ties to their Assyrian neighbors. In fact, there was a considerable degree of intermarriage, bilingualism, and cooperation between the two groups on many fronts, commercial as well as political. This presentation will thus detail the intertwined histories of the Urmia region's Armenians and Assyrians, with much of the information coming from Assyrian memoirs and histories, as well as inscriptions collected in the field. Now, the greater Urmia region in Iran's West Azerbaijan province has traditionally been one of the country's most diverse areas. In addition to indigenous Christian Assyrian and Armenian communities, it has also been home to Muslim Turkic Azeris, Kurds and Persians, as well as Aramaic-speaking Jews. Now, before the 19th century, however, the Armenian community was much larger. Now, as a result of the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828, which ended the Russo-Persian Wars, a large number of Urmia's Armenians immigrated to especially Yerevan province in the Russian Empire. And already by the mid-19th century, their community was losing its former dominance in the region. Now, a little over a century ago, the Lake Urmia Basin's western half was dotted with over 200 Christian villages, populated by ethnic Assyrians and Armenians. Maybe if I could use the mouse. Sorry. I apologize. Thank you so much. Now, is it working?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to bring it here. Okay, so historically the Armenians formed the majority population in the districts of Salamas, and Chara and Somaye, and they possessed their own settlements as far south. There's a pointer. Thank you so much. That's what I was looking for. Okay, I'll put this here. So, Salamas, Somaye, Chara, and then they had some of their own settlements coming down to the middle of the Urmia plain. So, from there on, Assyrians predominated. So, it was basically half-half. In the northern half of the Urmia area, Armenians were the majority. In the southern half, the Assyrians were the majority. Now, throughout most of these areas, Assyrians and Armenians lived side by side in shared settlements, often praying at one another's churches and burying their dead in the same cemeteries. Since they were both Christians living under Islamic domination, they considered each other co-religionists and thus cooperated with one another to a high extent. Now, in terms of religious solidarity, it is widely believed that Miaphysites and Nestorians could never get along. Yet, in the broader Urmia region, the Miaphysite Armenians and the Nestorian Assyrians had an unspoken rule of intercommunal cooperation and coexistence. Generally, Assyrians adhering to the Church of the East considered the Armenian Church as the nearest to their own, and did not oblige, for example, an Armenian girl who married one of their men to convert to their church. On the other hand, a Protestant or Catholic girl who was Assyrian would have to always be baptized back into the old church. So we accepted the Armenian church, but not the Catholics or the Protestants. So, on the other hand, the Armenians opened up their churches to adherents of the Church of the East in Urmia to perform their religious services after their own churches had been confiscated by the Russian Orthodox mission after 1901. They did the same for the Hakkari Assyrians that arrived in Salamas between 1915 and 1918, since they were not allowed to pray in the Chaldean Catholic churches. Now, generally, the Armenians and Assyrians would go on pilgrimage and pray in each other's churches, as well as attend each other's special occasions, whether festive or mournful. Moreover, both groups venerate many of the same saints, and it was not unusual for the same church building to be shared or to pass back and forth from one community to another, often blurring both confessional and ethnic boundaries, and causing confusion as to which church belonged to which group. Often, when the last Armenians left a certain village, they would entrust the keys of their churches not to their main church in the city or in Tabriz, but to a local Assyrian that stayed in the village. So intermarriage, while often frowned upon by elders of both communities, particularly Armenians, has also been quite common since the earliest of times. Additionally, those Assyrians who lived close to Armenians or who had mixed ancestry could speak Armenian and vice versa. Some were even literate in each other's languages. For instance, this is the tombstone of an Assyrian youth from Iryawa, or in Armenian, Rahva, and it reads, Joseph, son of Baba, lived 16 years. He rested on the 10th of February 1901. He was literate in 3 languages, Persian, Armenian, and Syriac. Now, in a more recent example that I can give, an Armenian identifying informant in Urmia, who was the son of an Armenian father and an Assyrian mother, actually justified his marriage to an Assyrian woman because she could read and write in Armenian. So his wife was fully Assyrian, but she could read and write in Armenian, and he said, it's important because I want my children to be able to learn how to read and write Armenian and not just speak. And their mother, even though she's Assyrian, will be able to help them learn. On the other hand, I know a doctor from Urmia who now lives in San Francisco, and despite his paternal line being Armenian, his mother and father's mother were Assyrians. So he identifies as Assyrian rather than Armenian. He even has an Armenian last name. So you see how these lines are very blurred in Urmia. In another case, I met 2 Assyrian brothers in the village of Iryawa. One was named Hayastan and his brother was named Yerevan. And that's because they had an Armenian grandmother who was very strong and insisted that they have Armenian names. So the Lake Urmia Basin's western half consists of a series of fertile plains and upland valleys separated from one another by chains of mountains. So from the north to the south, as you would have seen in the other map, you have Salamas, Anzal, Urmia, Sulduz, etc. And towards the mountains in the west, you have Somaya, Bradost, Targawar, Margawar. Now, the largest of these districts is the Urmia Plain, and this is what it sort of looks like, which is crisscrossed by a network of 3 river systems that flow from the mountains in the west to the lake. And from the north to the south, you have the rivers of Nazlu Chai, Shahar Chai or City River, and Barandas Chai. Now, the Salamas Plain is dominated by a separate river, it's called the Zula Chai, and the Ushnu and Sulduz Plains have another river as well called the Gader River, the Gader Chai. Now, in medieval Armenian geographies, the area that we're talking about was occupied, occupied 7 of the 9 gavars or cantons of Parska or Pers Armenia, also known as Noshirakan. And that was the 7th province of the ancient kingdom of Armenia, or Metzhai. So you have the areas of Zarehavan, Arnai, Tamber, Aili, Trabigavar, Marigavar, which we know today as Tergawar, Margawar, and Araskh. So Armenians could be found in all of these districts except for Targawar, Margawar, the mountain areas of Targawar, Margawar, and the city of Ushnu, which is down here. Okay. So, in the Shahar-Chai district, at the center of the Urmia plain, and surrounding the city, Assyrians and Armenians cohabitated 11 villages. I'm not going to say their names, they're up there. They also lived together in the urban quarters of, it's a little bit slow, of Gul Fatah Ali Khan, or Gul, around Hafez Street, and Mat Mariam, or St. Mary, around Khayyam Street. Now, in the former, where Armenians predominated, their church, dedicated to St. Stephen, and originally built in the 16th century, the original does not exist anymore, is located opposite the Assyrian Chaldean Catholic Cathedral. There is also an Armenian private school located nearby on the same block as 2 Assyrian private schools. Even in the Matmarian quarter, which is around Khayyam Street, one can find Armenian inscriptions in the yard of the historic Virgin Mary Assyrian Church, as well as in the baptistry of the church itself. So you can see some of that. Now furthermore, roughly 17% of the inscribed tombstones in the major necropolis of Charbash, where the city's Christians also buried their dead, belong to Armenians, so 17%. Relations between the Armenians and largely Chaldean Catholic Assyrians in Urmia's Gurn quarter were very close. It should thus come as no surprise, therefore, that we discover an Armenian from Gurn who was buried at Charbash, who was not only a convert to Catholicism, but he was a priest and a student of the Propaganda College in Rome, before being consecrated as a Vardavet. So his epitaph, which is in Assyrian, not in Armenian, maybe the other side is in Armenian, but I couldn't lift the stone, it was very heavy, reads, Aristakes Vardavet, Catholic priest, student of the Propaganda, son of Ter Hartun, departed from the world 5th of December 1900. Now in other villages, one can still visit existing Armenian churches, and I'm not going to go through too much detail, but in the village of Gulpashan, you have a shared cemetery, which is shared by about 5 or 6 villages, including a few Armenian villages. So it's a large cemetery in between all these villages, and Assyrians and Armenians both buried their dead in this village's cemetery. Now, that's what the cemetery looks like. So on the other hand, there are instances where Armenians have claimed ownership of sacred edifices that are important sites of pilgrimage belonging to the Assyrians. So this is the case for the 8th century monastery of Saints Peter and Paul. We say Mar Patros Mar Paulus, Armenians say Sub Bohos Petros. Okay? At Kenisa Kande, which was built by the Church of the East, is officially owned by the Chaldean Catholic Church and is claimed by some Armenians as being theirs. And actually, once I went to visit the church and they had pictures of the Armenian Catholicos in the church on there. So it's very interesting. Now similarly, the 7th century monastery of Saints Sergius and Bacchus at Marsergis is believed to have been originally Syriac Orthodox, so West Assyrian. According to legend, it was built by Persian Emperor Khosrow Parviz for his Christian wife, Shireen, in the 6th century, and at the behest of the physician Gabriel the Jacobite, he ensured that it was served by clergy from the Syriac Orthodox Church. Now, sometime later, however, it was taken over by the Church of the East, and is now even claimed by some Armenians as having once belonged to them. And on the walls of the church, some Armenians still leave votive inscriptions and votive offerings inside the church. So here you can see some of the graffiti in Armenian on some of the stones of the church. Now, the most significant village in this district where Assyrians and Armenians lived together was that of Iriawa, which I mentioned, and it was the birthplace of Armenian author Emmanuel Varandyan. And it now forms a neighborhood in the northeast part of Urmia's urban sprawl. Now the village's 2 oldest churches are located in a spacious courtyard at the village's eastern edge, and they're still in use. The Assyrian church on the right is dedicated to St. George, and it's shorter and smaller, built of mud brick faced with fired bricks, with wooden columns and a flat roof. The Armenian church is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and it's taller, built of stone with elegant domes, held up with large round columns. Now the Assyrians claim that it was originally dedicated to Saint Nargis. So, Margi Wargis, Mar Nargis. And they say that Saint Nargis was the sister of St. George. Now it appears that it was actually the older of the 2 churches, and it was built sometime in the 17th century. Now local tradition holds that they were formerly connected to one another. It was formerly one church, but then it was separated by the Russians when it was rebuilt in around 1892. Now, the only dates that we have from these buildings are from inscriptions that are above the doors of the two churches, and you'll notice that they're exactly the same, just one's in Armenian, one's in Assyrian, and the Armenian one is from 1892, the Assyrian one is from 1914. Now, to the north of the churches is the former Christian school, shared by both communities, and it has now been restored and is used as a local social hall for them. Now, historically, Armenians were 45% of this village's population, and its landowner was also an Armenian. So we're going to go from Sharchai to the Nazluchai area, and that's the only area that contains 4 Armenian majority villages. The most important one is Gardavat, to the east of the main highway between Urmia and Salamas, and it was once an entirely Christian settlement, home to a few Assyrians as well, prior to World War I. Due to its central location between Urmia and the airport, the local airport, it's still home to the region's largest Armenian population. And they live alongside a number of Azeris that have bought houses and land in the village. Now, among the 5 Christian places of worship that still stand around Gardabad is a large chapel dedicated to a Surp Maragha. Now, I've never heard that name before. And Maragha sounds like Assyrian, like Mar something. So it could be that it was originally an Assyrian church that was taken by Armenians. I don't know. I don't have a photo of it though. Now, Assyrians also lived in the formerly important Armenian settlement of Nakhchivan Tepe, which was once an entirely Christian village as well. It is now home to an Azeri majority, and when I visited it in 2010, there was only one Armenian household inhabited by an elderly man who was a deaf mute and his sister, probably passed away since. Now, the 17th century Armenian Church of the Holy Mother of God, with its thick mud brick walls, is still well kept, and the edifice is unique for its wooden roof, which includes a dome built over its sanctuary in the ancient Armenian Hazarashen, or 1,000 log technique. There you can see the interior of the church and the last Armenians from that village. Now, most Nazluchai Armenians inhabited 18 villages, which they shared with Assyrians. Often the churches were shared or changed hands between Armenians and Assyrians. For instance, this is the church of Badenbu, which was established in the 18th century. It's dedicated to St. John now and belongs to the Armenians. But the Assyrians were the only inhabitants of the village in 1825. So the Armenians came later and took the church. And according to the Assyrians, this is the Church of the Virgin Mary. But we don't have any inscriptions in the church, but there is a baptismal font in the yard of the church, which is Armenian style, which is rectangular. And also Assyrians and Armenians are interred side by side in the village cemetery. Now, a poignant reminder of Assyrian-Armenian cooperation is evident in the village of Ada, which once possessed an Armenian church dedicated to St. John called Surpevanus by the Assyrian villagers. It was a 17th century mud brick church with a wooden roof to the east of the village. In the 1970s, it fell into ruins. And some years later, local Assyrians built a small shrine in its place dedicated to St. Stephen. Now, in 2013, the keys to this chapel were symbolically handed over to the representative of the Armenian Apostolic Church in Tabriz. So now the keys to this shrine are back with the Armenian Church. Now, in other villages of the district, Armenian churches were built in close proximity to Assyrian ones. Let me see. No, I lost that slide. That's okay. For example, in the village of Supurghan, you have 3 churches in the same yard. So one church is St. George. It belongs to the Assyrian Church of the East now. It was actually originally Assyrian Church of the East, then it was confiscated by the Russians and was given back later. And in the same yard you have a Chaldean Catholic Church of the Virgin Mary and an Armenian Church of St. Sarkis, Subsarkis. And it's in the same yard. So, on the other hand, in other villages where Assyrians did not have a church of their own, or Armenians did not have a church of their own, they would pray in the local church, whichever community it belonged to. So for example, the Armenians in Yangija would go to this Assyrian church in Yangija, the Assyrians in Ikiarach would also go to the Armenian church in Ikiarach, for example. So you have this example of Christian solidarity, where dogma was the last thing on their minds, and they actually didn't mind going to each other's churches and praying together. The Armenians didn't understand Krapa, and the Assyrians didn't understand Classical Syriac, so it made no difference. So further north, in the district of Anzal, some Armenians also lived with Assyrians in the villages of Gaviran and Jamalava, as well as the exclusively Armenian settlement of Qarabakh. Now in 1825, the population of Gaviran was entirely Assyrian, and the population of Jamalava, which is in the background, was entirely Armenian. Sometime around then we see that the local Armenians started leaving to come here to Yerevan, and the Assyrians started moving into Jamalava. So in 1830, when American missionaries Smith and Dwight came to Jamalava, they found 22 Assyrian families and about 15 to 20 Armenian families. So the Assyrians had their own bishop and priest, the Armenians had their own church as well, Sub Nishan, which the Assyrians call Shamrishan for some reason. And the Armenian priest actually came from Ada to serve them. Now the ruins of the church can still be seen, as well as the Assyrian church in the same village, which is still in use, maybe once a year. So additionally, you have the large village of Qarabakh in the most fertile part of the Anzal district, and it's well known for its impressive stone church dated to St. Peter, built in 1655, which is still in very good repair even though it's empty and inactive. It appears to have been an important site for local pilgrimage, including for Assyrians, since pilgrims' graffiti in Syriac can be found etched onto its interior walls. So you can see some people have written in Armenian, some people have written in Syriac on the plaster. So going south, we have the Barandas Chai district, where there were no exclusively Armenian settlements. So they all, the Armenians all lived together with Assyrians in about 14 villages. Additionally, some Armenians lived in the large Kurdish village of Qasimlu. Now, some of these villages, such as Takkan Ardishai, attracted Armenians and Assyrians that had been displaced from their homes in other districts because of the First World War. And a large number of Assyrians from Solduz, or Naqadeh, moved to the village of Balanush, which was mostly an Armenian village during the 19th century. So the local church is dedicated to St. John the Baptist, and the original structure was built in the 17th century, but it was renovated 1840, 1888, and the last renovation was in 1970, and its current structure is from a renovation in 1981. Now you can see that there are some Armenian inscriptions and some Armenian crosses, but the architecture of the church is not Armenian. The architecture of the church, with its tripartite sanctuary, with the altar right up against the east wall of the sanctuary, that's Assyrian architecture, but it's an Armenian church. So here you see probably Assyrians built this church for the Armenian community, and they built it in their own style, but they are using the church together, and it belongs to the Armenian church. So, also you have the village of Dizataka, which was a mixed Assyrian and Armenian village, one of the largest and most important Christian centers in the Barandas Chai district. In 1973, its 180 households still included 70 Assyrian families and 10 Armenian families. By 2010, the Assyrian population had shrunk to 3 households and no Armenians. Armenians had not lived there for decades. But the local Armenian Virgin Mary Church is now maintained by the Assyrians, who claim that it has historically been shared by both communities, and despite its clearly Armenian interior layout and architecture, the Assyrians sometimes use it to pray. It has not been altered or tampered with, and Assyrian villagers have built a shrine to a saint called Rabban Hormuz against its north wall, and as well as the village events hall. Also, you have the villages of Sardarud, Darbarud, and Babarud in the Barandas Delta, where the communities were so closely knit, the Assyrians and the Armenians, that they developed their own language. They developed their own dialect of Turkish, which had some Assyrian and Armenian words, as a means to communicate with each other. So the Assyrians wouldn't have to learn Armenian, the Armenians wouldn't have to learn Assyrian. So also here they shared churches. Here you can see the communal cemetery, which both Assyrians and Armenians buried their dead in. So it's actually in the yard of this church. So it's an Assyrian church, and in the yard of the Assyrian church you have Assyrian and Armenian graves together. So in the Solders district, south of the Urmia plain, Assyrians and Armenians lived together in about 6 or 7 villages and towns. In 1892, Lord Curzon estimated the Assyrian population at 400 families and noted about 160 Armenian families. I'm going to skip some things because I've got a lot of detail. You don't need too much detail. But I'm going to talk about Maragha. So Maragha is an important town to the southeast of Lake Urmia, where Christian Armenians and Assyrians live together historically. Now, the city's Armenian community is believed to date back as far as the 5th century. On the other hand, a Syriac Orthodox presence, including immigrants from Urfa, Edessa, with a church and priest, are first attested to in the 12th century. Now, the city rose to prominence during the Mongol Ilkhanate period and was the residence of the Catholicos Patriarch Dinha I and the permanent residence of Catholicos Patriarch Yabalaha III, both of the Assyrian Church of the East. Now, during this time, the Church of the East built new churches and monasteries in the city, and it also became the residence of the Syriac Orthodox Catholicos, Gregory Bar Hebraeus, who was a very famous polymath and author of the Middle Ages. Now, when he died in 1286 in Maragha, his funeral was not only attended by the Church of the East's Catholicos Patriarch Yabalaha III, but also all the Armenian clergy. And all of the city's Christians actually closed their shops on that day in respect and attended the funeral. Now, in September 1295, Muslim mobs looted and destroyed the patriarchal residence and church, one of the churches. But the other church was spared because of the Armenian king Hetum II of Kilikia, who was visiting his Mongol allies. So he was able to save one of the Assyrian churches in Maragha by bribing the local Muslim mobs not to destroy it. At the same time, Patriarch Yabalaha III was arrested and tortured by the Emir Nowruz, but he was released because of Hetum II's intervention. So in disguise, the Patriarch departed to Tabriz for his safety in the Armenian king's retinue and under the Armenian king's protection. So here you can see in the Middle Ages, you had this symbiosis and cooperation between Armenians and Assyrians. So Maragha's Assyrian community appears to have come to an end by the mid-14th century, but on the eve of the First World War, a handful of Assyrian families lived there, but they were not native to the town. Among them were the priest Moses Murhach of Urmia of Guktapa, who translated the Quran from Arabic into Assyrian, and his son-in-law, whose diary I'm now working on translating. His name was Dr. Joel Joseph of Baz, and he was a distinguished physician and well loved by the local people. So these Assyrian families would either attend services in the Armenian church or the Presbyterian Evangelical Church which was attended by Armenians and Assyrians, even though the priest was Assyrian. Assyrians and Armenians lived together in most of these places, including Chara, the village of Huasan, and the village of Gengachin. Now, at all three locations, the Assyrians and Armenians maintained their own separate churches, but they had a historical, let's say, shared coexistence with each other. You can see here also a similar population. You had, from Lord Curzon's estimates in 1892, about 200 Assyrian families, 280 Armenian families, with the majority of the Assyrians in the south and the majority of the Armenians in the north. Now, Salamas, or Old Armenian Zarehavan is, so this is the Old Armenian village of Pakajik. Payaj, yeah. So this is a very important area, especially for Armenian history, and it has a lot of archaeological sites that attest to the area's antiquity of human settlement. So you can see there are large artificial mounds or tells, probably concealing the ruins of ancient Urartian or Manayan settlements, as well as a 3rd century relief depicting the first Sasanian emperor Ardashir I and his son Shapur the Great receiving the submission of a local Armenian king, carved into the cliff at a place called Khan Tahti. Now, historically, Armenians formed the majority ethnic group in Salamas's population, and their oldest churches in the district date between the 11th and 13th centuries. As early as the 7th century, Christian Assyrians are recorded as having inhabited the Salamas district as a minority ethnic group. After a large number of Armenians immigrated to the Russian Empire, however, the Armenian community lost its former dominance and the Assyrians' numbers began to increase. And a lot of Assyrians started moving into the Armenian villages. But in general, relations between the Assyrians and Armenians of Salamas do not appear to have been as close as those in other districts, probably because the Assyrians had mostly converted to Catholicism in the 16th, 17th centuries. Despite the fact that a lot of Salamas Armenians were Catholic between the 13th and 15th centuries, but they had returned to the Apostolic Church, and the Assyrians in Salamas became Catholic. Now, although Assyrians predominated in the western half of the Salamas plain, they largely lived together with Armenians, except for in one village. The villages, therefore, where Armenians and Assyrians lived together include Khosrawa, which was a major Assyrian center, as well as 10 other villages, and in the large Armenian village of Haftavan and Malham, as well as Tamar, or the historical Tamber, Assyrians comprised a small minority of the inhabitants and did not have their own churches and chapels. Now, the Christian population in the 10 villages of the Salamas Plains eastern half, these ones and more, were exclusively Armenian. So these are all the Armenian villages in the eastern part of the Salamas Plain, in the northern part of the Salamas Plain, and to the west in the mountains. Now, on the eve of the First World War, you had roughly 10,000 Assyrians in 12 villages and about 10,000 Armenians in about 23 villages. So Armenians had a larger distribution, they lived in more villages, and it shows that obviously a lot of their population had left the area, otherwise they would have been larger in number. Now, historically, a number of important churches and monasteries in the district have exchanged hands between both communities. For example, in the village of Gulezan, which was originally an Armenian village but was deserted in the early 19th century, and by 1855 had been taken over by the Assyrians, who used its old Armenian church of St. Sarkis. And then also in the village of Kuchamish, you have another church of St. Sarkis, which was an Assyrian church that was taken over by the Armenians. So you have this exchange. Now, this is interesting. The monastery of St. John the Martyr on the hill crowning Konashahar's Christian cemetery in Salamas, during the 16th and 17th centuries, this was the residence of a number of Catholic Assyrian patriarchs. And it was where the Catholic Patriarch Mar Shimon Dincha IX was elected in 1580 and wrote his Catholic profession of faith in 1585. And that's the last time this monastery is mentioned in Assyrian sources. An Armenian church was built here in 1825, and it's not known how many times the site passed back and forth between the two peoples, but for a long time it was considered a local center of pilgrimage and healing. And it was visited by an American missionary in the 1880s who mentioned that it contained a healing pit for faith cures. Nothing of it remains today. Salamas actually suffered a very bad earthquake in 1930. So a lot of the old Armenian and Assyrian churches in the area were completely destroyed. So all you see at the site when you go there today is some walls built by an Assyrian from a nearby village with the stones from the ruins, just to mark the site. Very close is the ruins of another church. Local Muslims call it Suambar. Probably comes from Armenian Surk Barbar. The Armenians call it Surk Barbara, and the Assyrians call it Saint Anna, Saint Hanna. They say she was the sister of Saint John. But I don't know, there's no inscriptions, but that's the remains of the door to the church. And so you can see also that Assyrians, Armenians shared religious sites. They had reverence for the same religious sites, and sometimes even Muslims as well. Significantly, Konashar was the administrative center of the Salamas district in medieval times until the exodus of 1828. The majority of its inhabitants were Armenians. After that, it was practically deserted. We know maybe 400 or 500 Armenian families left Konashar and came to this part of the world. This is a very bad image of a 17th century dedicatory inscription which mentions an Assyrian ostad, or master builder, called Abda, who built both the local Assyrian church of St. Kyriakos and the local Armenian church of St. Sarkis in 1671. Now, the last Christians to leave Konashar were a mixed Armenian-Assyrian family that moved to Tehran by 1972. Now, the most telling example of intercommunal cooperation is that of the Armenian Church of St. Sergius at Khosrawa in Salamas. It was first built for the community in 1717, but during the First World War, it opened its doors to Assyrian refugees from Hakkari and Van in 1915. Since the Assyrians of Hakkari and Van were mostly members of the Church of the East, they were not allowed to worship in the churches belonging to the Catholics. Like I said, the Assyrians of Salamas were mostly Catholic. Now, in March 1918, the Catholicos Patriarch, Mar Binyamin Shimon, was assassinated by the Kurdish tribal leader, Ismail Agha, or Simko, and along with 50 of his guards. Now, when his mutilated body was retrieved from the scene of the massacre, the funeral was conducted in Surbsarkis church in Khosrawabad. The Assyrians, even though they were Catholic, did not allow the heretical Nestorian patriarch to be buried in their church. So it was the Armenians at Konashar who warned the patriarch not to come to meet Simko. They had sheltered the survivors of the massacre. They had brought word to the patriarch's family in Khosrawa about what happened, and also they helped bring his body back for burial at their church in Khosrawabad. Now, today the church, complete with its Armenian inscriptions and small Armenian graveyard, is symbolically cared for by the Assyrian Church of the East. So I'm going to also talk about the main Armenian town in the Salamas plain, Haftavan, or historical Zarahavan, which was also an important center for cultural and literary activity. Even today, one can see the facade of a theatre attributed to the legendary novelist and playwright Rafi, a leading figure in the 19th century Armenian literature and national movement. and he played a very important role in the development of modern Armenian nationalism. A lot of people maybe don't know that his wife, Anna Hormuz, also known as Mrs. Anna Rafi, was the daughter of an Assyrian Presbyterian minister from the village of Guytapa in Urmi. She was highly educated and spoke 6 languages: Assyrian, Armenian, English, Turkish, Russian, Georgian, and she was a graduate of the Fisk Seminary, which was an American missionary school for girls in Urmia. Rafi, this is very romantic, Rafi had met Anna while attending her graduation ceremony in 1863. And then they were married a few months later. Now, after Rafi's death, she devoted the rest of her life to publishing many of his works with the help of the Mechitarist congregation in Vienna. And one of her greatest desires was to publish her husband's biography, and it's a task that she worked on for many years while taking care of their 2 children, Arshak and Aram. Additionally, she was an active scholar of the Armenian question. In the late 1890s, Anna and her sons moved to London, where she died on the 24th of June 1920, 8 months after her son Aram's death. Now, her other son, Arshak, in 1919, became the first Republic of Armenia's first ambassador to the United Kingdom. So that's also very interesting. The product of a mixed marriage, Assyrian-Armenian mixed marriage from Urmia, was the Republic of Armenia's first ambassador in England. Now, during the First World War, Ottoman troops invaded the Urmia region twice and inflicted severe atrocities and massacres on local Assyrians and Armenians, most notably at Haftavan, which the Ottomans used as a military base, and also where up to 800 of the Salamas district's Armenians and Assyrians were butchered and their headless corpses were thrown into wells. In total, it is estimated that 25,000 Christians fled with the retreating Russian troops, with 2,000 of them dying on the way. For the lucky ones who reached safety in Russian Transcaucasia, many of them were looked after by local secular and religious authorities. For instance, we have a letter from the governor of Yerevan to the head of the Brotherly Help Committee in January 1915, and he says, "We should equally care for all refugees, regardless of their nationality. Therefore, I ask you not to forget the Assyrians." In another letter sent by the Armenian Archbishop of Azerbaijan, Nersis Melik Tangian, to a friend of his in February 1917, the bishop writes, "Give my regards to Patriarch Marshamun, Marbinyamin, and tell him I take care of his people. There is no difference for me between Armenians and Assyrians." Between 1915 and 1918, hundreds of Armenian volunteers joined an armed force commanded by Assyrian General Agha Petros Elov, which policed and defended the area. Agha Petros was in constant contact with Armenian General Antranik Ozanian Pasha at Van, and did his best to maintain Christian control of the Urmia region, even after being abandoned by the Russians due to the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. Eventually, the forces gave up as the ammunition provided by the Russians had run out, and the general fear and panic that plagued the area as a result of being encircled during the war, they abandoned their homes on the 1st of August 1918, fleeing to Hamadan and then British Mesopotamia among a convoy of about 80,000 refugees. Now, out of those 80,000 refugees, less than 50,000 actually survived. Among them was also my grandfather. Now, after the war ended, many of the survivors returned to their homes. Their numbers, however, had been severely reduced. For example, in June 1919, Reverend Miller of the American Presbyterian Mission counted only 184 Assyrian and Armenian Christians in Salamas, only 3 of whom were adult males. All the other adult males had been murdered. In 1922, the Persian government allowed groups of Assyrians and Armenians to return from the Bakuba refugee camp in British Mesopotamia and to resettle in their villages. While a number of Armenians had already made their way over to the United States or decided to stay put in Baghdad and Basra, many of them patiently waited along with Assyrian refugees in cities such as Hamadan, Qazvin, Kermanshah and Tabriz until the government deemed it safe for a certain number of them to return, because Simko, Ismail Agha, was at large in the area, and he was rebelling against the Iranian government. So the Persian authorities had enforced quotas determining just how many Assyrians and Armenians could return in order to ensure that they would never again be an important element of the local population. Since the number of Assyrians that returned did not meet the limits set by the government, Assyrians that wanted to return actually took Armenian places by changing their surnames to Armenian names and saying that they were Armenian. So that was a way in which a lot of Assyrians were able to return because so many Armenians did not return. Now, the Urmia region's Assyrians and Armenians were again caught up in the violence that marked the rise and fall of the Azerbaijan People's Republic, which was a Soviet puppet state, in 1945 and 1946. Beside the Assyrian Church of the Virgin Mary at Chahar-Bakhsh, there are 8 gravestones belonging to 10 Assyrians and 1 local Armenian. 7 of them were killed around 4 p.m. On the 15th of December 1945 in a sudden attack on a local Azerbaijani Democratic Party headquarters by Iranian gendarmes and a tank belonging to their security forces. So the epitaph of the Armenian, which bears parallel inscriptions in Assyrian and Armenian, reads, "The mighty youth Khosrov, son of Aqob Tatavosyan of Chahar-Bakhsh, lived 23 years. He was cruelly murdered by gendarmes for the sake of freedom, 15th of December 1945. We thus witness that, during the period in question, both Assyrian and Armenian men were caught up in a conflict that was not their own and were brutally murdered by Iranian security forces retaking the area. Consequently, the Urmia region's Assyrians and Armenians initiated a steady exodus away from their traditional homes to the larger urban centers of Iran and afterward to the diaspora, as they lost their hope in the recreation of their communities. There are currently little more than 5,000 Assyrians and 500 Armenians left in the Urmia area. And out of the 500 Armenians, I just came from Iran, so I was able to ask, about 300 of them are not full-blood Armenians, they have mixed Assyrian-Armenian ancestry. So, from the data preserved in Assyrian inscriptions from the Urmia region, we can observe many examples of cooperation and coexistence between them, between the Assyrians and Armenians, whether in the form of intermarriage or intercommunal business partnerships. It is therefore noticeable that it was more common for Armenian men to marry Assyrian women, and many Assyrians are also found to have had Armenian or Armenian-sounding names. Furthermore, bilingual funerary inscriptions in Assyrian and Armenian, including Armenian epitaphs and Assyrian biblical quotations, were common, probably indicating either mixed ancestry or intermarriage. So you can see this is a very old gravestone. These are from Salamas. You see, it's not going back. It will only go forward. It's okay. So you can see it's Armenian, but there in the top left-hand corner you have some Syriac, and then on one side you have Syriac. Then you have, again, an Armenian or 2 Armenian gravestones and an Assyrian gravestone. So, you know, they're buried in the same cemeteries, and often their gravestones have inscriptions in both languages, which is very interesting. So these also include gravestones that were carved by Assyrian artisans for Armenian clients and vice versa, testifying to the close relationship of coexistence which has historically linked these two peoples. Significantly, at least 3 of the Armenian craftsmen or artisans signed their names in Assyrian, so they knew how to write in Assyrian as well. Additional examples, so you can see here, so this is belonging to someone called Karapet Sarkisyan. I think the Armenian says that too. I'm reading the Syriac. So you can see these people were either married to people from the other group or not. This is interesting because it's an Armenian tombstone, but it says here in Syriac, its price is 18 tumans in Assyrian. Maybe he thought it wasn't right to write it in Armenian, I don't know. There you have an Armenian gravestone with a biblical quotation in Assyrian. Alahele ilibit gyosa, God is for me a refuge. Again, you have an Armenian tombstone with the signature of the person who made it, who was an Assyrian. Now, additional examples of graffiti inscriptions have been found at important sites of local pilgrimage, including those by Armenian visitors to Assyrian churches and vice versa, further indicating amicable relations between the two neighboring peoples during the 19th and 20th centuries. Such graffiti are particularly significant in tangibly demonstrating the importance of such pilgrimage sites to local Assyrians and Armenians and the places which both peoples held to be sacred. So, I'm coming to my conclusion. The Assyrians and Armenians are two kindred peoples with intertwined histories of coexistence and cooperation. From the earliest times, both historic and legendary, they have been part of one another's national stories at some point, and at some of the most defining and unexpected points in time. Indeed, this is an affinity that has been further discovered and highlighted in recent genetic and DNA studies, which have demonstrated a common ancestry for many contemporary Assyrians and Armenians. On a more practical level, both peoples today share many customs and traditions, particularly the annual summer water festival of Vardavar, which the East Assyrians know as Nusardim, and they celebrate on the same day, and a number of traditional dances, Sheikhani, Shirkhani, Ishkhanapar, whatever you want to call it. Now, in general, Assyrian foods, music and song also share much in common with Armenian forms of the same, as did their modes of dress in many of the areas which they cohabitated. Nowhere can this similarity be observed and demonstrated better than in the greater Urmia region. While speaking different languages and adhering to different national churches with divergent Christological doctrines, the two ethnicities often functioned as one community due to their common Christian beliefs and shared values, as well as mutual experiences of persecution and discrimination. As such, they not only shared a strong spirit of solidarity with one another, but also deep cultural, marital, and kinship ties. And this is apparent in the way that they coexisted with one another in the same towns and villages, spoke or were even literate in each other's languages, attended one another's churches and schools, intermarried. By the way, the bride, she's the daughter, I think, no, the groom, is the son of Hayastan, which I mentioned before. And they even buried their dead in one another's cemeteries, or together in the same cemeteries. Even in their most defining moment of suffering, genocide under the Ottoman Empire, the Assyrians and Armenians suffered together and in many cases fell victim to the same massacres and forced migrations. Urmia's example is truly one that both communities can be proud of, and it is repeated in many other locations such as Urfa, Diyarbakir, Kharpert, Mardin, Qamishli, Aleppo, Halep, Zaho, and even Baghdad. It further exemplifies the manner in which Assyrians and Armenians can both cooperate and influence one another on many levels, having been neighbors since the most ancient of times. Now, I will end with this quotation from the very famous Armenian-American novelist William Saroyan from his short story 70,000 Assyrians, which he wrote after the Assyrian massacre in 1933 in Iraq. And he notes that the Assyrians, even though they speak a different language, they're from a different people, he says, but they have noses like our noses, eyes like our eyes, and hearts like our hearts. Let us hope that such strong bonds continue into the future as both peoples seek recognition and justice for their respective genocides, as well as security for those of them that still remain in the volatile Middle East. Thank you very much for your patience.